Okay, I'm just going to wait a moment while people join us. Okay. Thank you for joining us for a book discussion about Figures of the World by Chris Hill. My name is Anne Strother. I work in sales and marketing at Northwestern University Press, and I have a few very short announcements before we get started. This conversation is being recorded and streamed live to Northwestern University Press's Facebook page. The chat will be closed during this event, but you will be able to ask questions of the panelists using Zoom's Q&A feature, which is located along the bottom of your window. You may buy your own copy of Figures of the World for a 25% discount using promo code NUP2020. You can redeem this offer on our website, nupress.northwestern.edu. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce the panelists today. Chris Hill is an associate professor of Asian languages and cultures at the University of Michigan and the author of National History and the World of Nations. He writes frequently on literature and intellectual history from a transnational or global perspective and is currently researching Japanese writers' contributions to Afro-Asian solidarity movements. Christopher Bush is an associate professor in the Department of French and Italian at Northwestern University, where he co-directs the Global Avant-Garde and Modernist Studies graduate cluster and co-edits the journal Modernism, Modernity, and its Print Plus platform. Eleni Koundouriotis is a professor of English and comparative literary and cultural studies at the University of Connecticut Storrs. Her work addresses naturalism in the context of humanitarian discourse and the narration of war. Her new book, Narrating Human Rights in Africa, is forthcoming in January 2021. And Hector Hoyos is an associate professor of Latin American literature at Stanford University. He is the author of Beyond Bolaño, the global Latin American novel, and Things with History. Transcultural materialism, things with a history, pardon me, transcultural materialism and the literatures of extraction in contemporary Latin America. And without further ado, here are the panelists.
Okay, thank you, Anne. I also want to thank Northwestern University Press and Chris and Eleni and Hector for joining us for this event, and thank you as well to members of the audience who've zoomed in to hear this webinar. I just wanted to quickly give an overview of the book, talk about my inspiration for writing it, and then how I went about pursuing this topic. First of all, what is naturalism in literature? This is not always an extremely familiar term for people other than literary historians, but this book is a history of a kind of realistic fiction. It's called Naturalism on a large scale. I'm kind of hesitant to say global or world, but a large scale. And naturalism was supposed to be an objective kind of realism in the descriptive or sometimes scientific sense. It was supposed to be non-moralistic, supposed to reveal truths that society didn't want to see. And it crystallized in the 1860s in France out of currents in realist literature within Europe, in the work of Edmond and Jules de Goncourt, these brothers, and Émile Zola. And then over the next 60 years or so, it was adopted in many parts of the world around Europe, in South and North America. So Aloysio Azevedo, for example, in Brazil, Stephen Crane in the United States, in East Asia, for example, the work of the Japanese author Tayama Katai. And the travels of naturalism and its adoption in different parts of the world led to lasting changes in the writing of fiction, even in the cases of writers who were opposed to it, which I always found interesting. So the book is about how and why that happened, how writers adapted this way of writing novels in their own situations, and then what happened to literary form as a result. What propelled me to write this book? As some will know, in the 2000s and then onward, there have been debates in comparative literature about what's called world literature. A lot of the arguments, especially at the beginning, were arguments about what this phrase, originally from Goethe, should mean. Literature means this, no, world literature means that. It's highly theoretical and a lot of talk about what we would do if we actually did this, and not much actual research on literature in a large scale, which I found frustrating as someone who's been doing comparative work for quite a while. I also found that some of the most influential arguments, such as those of Franco Moretti and Pascal Casanova, had a hard time seeing work by writers outside of a small part of Europe as anything but derivative. So I knew that naturalism had traveled widely in the late 19th and early 20th century. And I asked myself if I could use the history of naturalist fiction to propose some methods for large-scale literary study that might help comparative literature, should we say, take the literature of the world outside Western Europe a little bit more seriously as a comparative undertaking. So the topic was the history of naturalist fiction, but the goal was to develop some new methods. So how did I go about that? You could say that I took two approaches, and one was kind of macro history, and the other was close reading of important naturalist works from France, Japan, and the United States. So for the macro history part, I was asking, how did naturalist fiction circulate around the world? What was the nature of this transnational phenomenon? And in looking at the way that naturalist fiction circulated, I found circuits of reading and adaptation that seemed to defy the usual assumptions about how this would happen. So just as one example, naturalism was adopted quickly in some places that were far from France, such as Brazil and Argentina, and late, if at all, in some places that were actually near, like Britain. And I also began to find kind of successive transformations as naturalism got around the world. And one sort of succinct example is naturalism in East Asia. Early naturalism, naturalist works began to appear in Japan around 1900, and over the next decade, they developed into a particular kind of what I call egocentric fiction about the psychology of the protagonist. And that form of naturalism was adopted by some Chinese and Korean writers who'd studied in Japan and began writing in this way when they went back to China and Korea, like Yu Da-fu and Yong Song-sok, for example. So it's a continual process of transformation. And then thinking about the nature of naturalism as a transnational phenomenon, I discovered as I worked through this history that there really was a transnational field of naturalist fiction that confounded Eurocentric expectations that the whole thing must have been a matter of imitating French models. As one example, there was a common habit of alluding to the work of Zola in obvious and sometimes ingenious, sometimes covert ways. And it seemed ultimately that that was kind of a way of signaling affiliation, that you were participating in this movement, rather than imitation. And that gesture of referring to Zola was one thing that kind of organized this field transnationally. Another thing that I found was that after the 1880s, most of the invention was going on at the so-called periphery of the literary world. And this was really some extremely interesting work, contrary to the assumption that it must be following in the tracks of French writers or metropolitan writers. The other approach in the book about close reading was kind of an excavation of why these works were so interesting. And I was asking, how did literary forms of styles of narration and description change as a consequence of the circulation and adaptation of naturalist fiction? And I approached that by looking at the history of what I call three figures as seen in a series of naturalist works. And by figure, I mean the place where figurative language like metonymy intersects with ideas about social description and objectivity. So the first figure had to do with the ailing body. We called it the body figure. This was sort of an investigation of figurative language concerned with degenerating and otherwise sick bodies. Second was the character type of the self-liberated woman, which was sort of initially brought together in Zola's novel Nana from 1880. So I called that the Nana figure. And then the third was a common habit of creating social microcosms like a neighborhood or a sailing ship as an encapsulation of social relations. And I called that the social figure. And as I looked at the history of these figures through particular novels, I really found that writers were taking apart and kind of pillaging earlier naturalist works to address new social situations. And in some cases that led to really radical revisions of method. The adaptation of naturalist methods to address new social situations also led to significant and really interesting changes in literary form. So two quick examples. Frank Norris, in his novel McTeague, shifted naturalist description toward the semiosis of money as a way of grappling with the issue of value in a capitalist society. Tayama Katai in Japan developed a method of description that he called heimen byosha, or flat description, in a novel called The Country Teacher, to describe the lived experience of uneven development in Japan in the Meiji period. So that's just a quick view of what the book is about and how I pursued this topic. Would just sort of sum it up by saying that this is a history of continuous transformation in topics, themes, and literary form, and transformations that happened because naturalist fiction was circulating around the world. It seemed that some of these things wouldn't have happened if naturalism had just sort of stayed put in France. And that the work of supposedly peripheral writers formed one of, or maybe the most important parts of this history. A couple of lessons that I learned and I hope to take away. To understand this kind of history on a large scale, You've got to set aside preoccupations with originality and imitation. Look for transformation in movement. And then finally, embrace the unexpected, because strange things happen when fiction moves around the world like this. So that's a quick view. I'm really interested to hear what Chris and Eleni and Hector have to say.
Great, thank you, Chris. That was so lucid. I'm not sure I have anything left to say now, but I will turn to my notes and see what I can do. I actually did want to start on that the topic of lucidity, which is to say, I think partly we're here to sort of ask you questions, and for us as interlocutors to sort of learn from you more about the ideas in the book, but also kind of speaking to the audience who maybe hasn't read the book yet. And so I think one of the purposes of this conversation is to laud the book and to celebrate this occasion. This is sort of a publication party in a way, and to encourage people to go out and read it. So I wanted to just first, before getting into the meat of it, just mention a couple of the general qualities of the book that I would, on the basis of which I would recommend it. I mean, one is I just want to point out what a kind of wonderfully skinny book it is, in the best possible sense. That is that the topic of naturalism is something I think that really the books are often very long and rambling, and they would not meet contemporary standards of brisk editing and plot. And I always think that bodies of scholarship, they tend to sort of reflect their objects in some ways. We see this, in individual critics and sometimes in whole schools of thought, and that often that the scholarship on naturalism often involves enormous tomes and lists of names and extensive plot summaries and so on. And so I just want to say, I really appreciate the enormous labor that went into producing such a book that is so reader friendly, that something that could easily have been 3 or 4 times long. It makes me think there's the old joke that's it's often attributed to Flannery O'Connor, although I don't know that she invented it, where she's about to give a speech and she says, "I'm sorry it's so long, but I didn't have time to make it shorter." Right? That it takes time and work to make things shorter, right? Unlike a person might think in a first-year writing class, right? Shorter is actually more work. Shorter is longer. And it somehow does this without becoming impossibly dense, right? It still actually has the sort of the lightness of a conversation and sort of immediate clarity and comprehensibility. So I just, that's a kind of thing that I think maybe isn't always visible or isn't always acknowledged. And I just think it's something that could, this book could have been 3 times as long and published a year or 2 ago, and it wouldn't be as good. So I just want to kind of, recognize that and encourage, any graduate students who might be listening to think about that as they move on with their own projects. Second of all, and this is sort of a riff on that same theme, is for me the book, this whole project, as I've been following it over the years, and now as I get to sort of see it in its, culmination in the form of this book, actually makes naturalism interesting to me, right? And I confess that I've never had an enormously great interest in naturalism as a genre, or as a form. I mean, some of course. I mean, I'm a curious person, but I never felt tempted to try to do a long project on it myself. I think like a lot of people, if you're studying the 19th century naturalism in France, it can come as a kind of a the end of the story, the thing that happened to naturalism, as if sort of Balzac and maybe a Flaubert were sort of the people we actually really like, but then we must discuss Zola, for the sake of completion, right? And then it tends to appear as a kind of a prelude in discussions of modernism and so on. And it's something that can easily be skipped over, but it's a very long and robust history, as you show. And so I think I'm better for being being forced to think about that period, not just sort of skip over that period as if it were a kind of novelistic Middle Ages or something, where we sort of say yada, yada, yada. And then, we sort of skip from Flaubert to modernism, but without really digging down into this period. And last but not least, for me, it's very generative, right? So although it is about this very particular object and it's really tied to that specific history, it makes me think about the way other cultural forms have traveled in other periods of time, or other forms of traveling contemporaneous with this, that beyond, even though I think it's attentive to the particulars of naturalism as a, whatever we would want to call it, a genre, a discourse, a kind of, cultural organism, or virus, or whatever we would like to, whatever metaphor we would like to settle on. It is always sort of seeking out kind of general principles of how forms are transformed through movement, how context changes the way things are read and rewritten, but also how the ways in which things are read and rewritten give us insight into the thing that we call a context, right? That we don't necessarily know. We can't just say this is the Argentine naturalism, right? We learn something about what happens to naturalism when it moves, but also we learn something about the context in which naturalism takes shape, right? It's sort of, there's an event-like quality to the readings. And so I found this really useful in me thinking about, for example, some of the historical avant-gardes, right, which you talk about very in passing, right? That these are also isms that travel and whose study has been plagued by debates about, in some ways held back by debates about originality and imitation, right? And so I think the way in which you kind of take that head on is something that I think could be really generative for people studying lots of different literary genres and periods and themes. All right, but to get into the substance of the text a little more, I wanted to isolate, I guess, have maybe three questions for you, three broad thematic questions, and then you can maybe choose one or two to discuss in the discussion, depending on how much time you have. One is I wanted to ask you the biggest of all questions, but in a small sort of way, which is the question of world literature. Last week I had to do a brief presentation on what's new in world literature. What are some new and interesting things that are happening in the field of world literature? And I talked about your book. But then I sort of immediately had to apologize and say, well, but he says about 10 times in the preface, this is not a world literature book, right? So please don't think it's a world literature book. So I wanted to kind of ask you to, you addressed it a little bit in the summary, but talk a little bit more about that productive tension with this question of world literature, right? That I think that you, in ways that are quite clear and that you've already explained, you're not trying to sort of immediately rocket up to the level of the global or the world, right? And yet the reference to that question or that problem seems inescapable, right? It's in the very title of the book, right? They're not just sort of figures of naturalism or figures of naturalist discourse. There's this question of the relationship to the world as a thing that is sort of always lurking as a potential misunderstanding or temptation or something, which you then kind of want to back up from. So I think it would kind of get us deeper into the ethos of the project to think about sort of what's that ambivalence of that relationship to the world, right? Then second, I wanted to ask you to reflect a little on the Zola as the sort of initiator figure. At one point in the book, you kind of talk about him as a sort of Foucauldian initiator of discourse, right? A little bit on the, like Foucault's examples were sort of more Marx and Freud and so on, like someone who can be invoked as a sort of authority that allows for a kind of generativity. And I think this is a really interesting, again, one of the things I like is the way you handle this, that there's a sort of, again, a kind of productive tension, which is to say, on the one hand, I would say that everyone would agree that in 21st century big comparative literature, whether it's world literature or not, we don't want to have a method where we're saying, start with Zola, end with Zola. How did Zola change? What was Zola's influence? Where we have a kind of a constant recurrence of these sort of, founding figures, usually male, usually bearded, very often French, right? Who have kind of, defined the scope of what's interesting or valuable about what we're doing. On the other hand, how can you possibly talk about the global circulation of naturalism as a discourse without Zola's name coming up time and time again? Because he's just sort of woven throughout the discourse, right? Even if you don't want to prioritize him, the other people that you're talking about are constantly referencing him and invoking him. And so I think that creates this kind of theoretical problem in a way, a methodological problem of both sort of acknowledging, but only acknowledging in certain ways and at certain moments, right? And in some of your earlier work on naturalism, you use the term iteration to talk about the kind of repetition and variation that doesn't require thinking of later versions of things as sort of derived or imitative of the original. But I wanted to kind of ask you to sort of talk a little more about that problem of sort of seriality and imitation so on, because I think it's one of the most conceptually generative things about the project for me. And then last but not least, then I'll stop, is I wanted to ask about sort of if there are, let's say, missing genres or things that were left out, you know, or things that kind of might have wound up in an addenda or might turn into subsequent articles that sort of had to get left out precisely because of the elegance and the concision of the book, right? So one thing that occurred to me, for example, in reading this as a whole now is thinking about the importance of naturalist theater at the time, right? And that if you were to approach the question of the circulation of naturalism through theater, it would give you a very related but very different framework for thinking about questions of translation, audience, you know, literacy, you know, who's paying for things to move here, you know, who's a famous author and who's not a famous author, et cetera. And of course, it was very important at the time, and it even shows up, let's say, in the plots of the novels, like in Nana and so on. So you can imagine sort of an alternative history, an alternative version of this book that would be kind of based on theater as a genre, right? Or a way of thinking about the afterlives of naturalism in terms of all the cinematic adaptations of naturalist novels, right? It has a very robust, the corpus of naturalist novels has a very robust life in early cinema and in early sound cinema and so on. Things that we casually refer to as realist, but it's actually really more from the naturalist corpus. Or even there's arguably there's a kind of naturalist poetry, like in German, for example, and so on. So obviously, you know, you had to have meaningful constraints, and the novel is, if you had to pick one, the novel is the most sensible one to do. But surely you encountered these other things and probably thought about them and had to make decisions about what to leave in and out. And so I just kind of wanted to ask about what if there are sort of, you know, generic fellow travelers that you left by the wayside, and what you would do with them if you ever went back to them. All right. And I think that's about a solid 10 to 12 minutes. So I think I'll stop there and ask Eleni to
okay.
your questions.
Thank you, first of all, for including me in this really interesting conversation, and congratulations, Chris, for this great book. My comments are a little more formal. I'm going to be reading, and hopefully that comes across okay in this new world of Zoom. And one of the reasons I'm doing this is I'm trying to kind of compress a lot of different points and directions. And also I wanted to mobilize, to put sort of out there some of Chris's terms. So I'm sticking a little bit closer to his language. All right, so Figures of the World is marked by admirable restraint. Unlike a lot of scholarship of our moment, it resists the temptation to be swept up into totalizing and homogenizing and usually monolingual paradigms of the global and world. By deploying the model of transnational form, which is a term that so far hasn't come up in our discussion, but it's very prominent in the book. The book is a study of wide comparative scope, offering for the first time a sustained discussion of naturalist novels across continents that includes Asia. The three-way comparison of French, US, and Japanese naturalism, in particular, pushes through some long-standing bottlenecks of comparative scholarship. The French-US axis displaces the dominant English-US paradigm of transatlantic scholarship. Moreover, instead of seeing French and American naturalisms as incompatible and totally different, which is the response I usually encounter whenever I approach my Americanist colleagues and with naive sort of excitement about the fact that they're interested in naturalism, and so am I. They always tell me, no, not Zola, we're not doing Zola, stay away. Anyway, Chris argues that thinking in terms of influence as imitation is beside the point. So he kind of opens up that potential conversation in very interesting ways. So not imitation, that's not the point. Instead, naturalism travels and transforms. It functions as a set of figures that propel story without prescribing its direction. The mark of naturalism finds many different vehicles of dissemination. I think that's what the Transnational enables Chris to do without being kind of snowed under the world and the global and all that homogenizing stuff that happens along the way. Although Zola is a point of departure, and that's the term that Chris uses and borrows from Auerbach, and the popularity and wide translation of Zola's work sets this phenomenon in motion. The figures, which I will repeat, are the deformed body, Nana, or the unbound woman, and the social figuration as a bounded milieu, escape the more rigid formulas of heredity and Darwinian determinism of Zola. Moreover, and perhaps most impactfully, by bringing Japanese literature into the conversation, Chris peels back habits of reading for difference from our location in the North American Academy. Through a literacy in naturalism, he demonstrates how connected we are to these works without flattening them. He holds on to their originality and brings us, for example, the Japanese I novel, that is, as in first-person I novel, as a naturalist subgenre, which extends what we thought was legible as naturalism, yet he makes it recognizable to us. And this will sort of connect up to my example from African literature that I'll turn to in the end, which I'm starting to think of as one of these I novels. The I novel, right, is an autobiographical fiction, a confessional fiction, which became associated with naturalism's aim to puncture social myths, right? The signature of its Zolaism, as Chris discusses it in the Japanese context. And this I novel offers also, in Chris's terms, a psychological autopsy, which I thought was a very effective term, that later changes into, quote, a fiction of the self premised on sincerity and authenticity, which for the Japanese is also a naturalistic feature. And I thought, well, sincerity may be in the kind of passion of the naturalists, but authenticity, I don't know if that's something that, you know, in the French context, we often think of the naturalists as they're so overlayered with their prose is so overlayered that it doesn't seem like the prototype of the authentic. So Chris manages to use these fresh terms, right, and to sort of mix, to bring it in a kind of a new flavor to this naturalism that is still recognizable as such, but is different. Okay, so the second takeaway, besides the transnational, is of course the importance of the figure of reading, right? Reading for metonymy, synecdoche, metaphor. We come to see that naturalism, this highly mimetic genre of social documentation, often described as an extreme form of realism, is illegible on the literal level. The language of naturalism, it turns out, is highly elusive. The figures carry over and travel far because they're rich metaphors. Here, some interesting tensions arise, as I sense that the figures actually even clash to a degree. Chris presents them as distinct, deflecting the question, what is naturalism, to ask instead, naturalism where and when? So he sort of almost avoids defining it, right? So it's more a matter of where do we find it, where and when? But we might yet ask how the figures relate to each other, while also noting that they tug at each other. For example, the deformed body, the first figure, stands for a society riven by social and economic inequality, and whose underbelly is bursting with into the open in disruptive and uncontrollable ways. The deformed body does not necessarily synergize with the unboundedness of the Nana figure, who has lost or never had any inhibitions. Nana is less a person than an energy who brings to the fore a clash between self-erasure and self-commodification and the desire she inspires in others to possess her. Born of the deformed body of Gervaise, Nana presents a fantasy of escape that, although defeated in the end by the biological reality of disease and contagion, is infinitely renewable as a fantasy. Putting both these figures, right, the cracked or deformed body and the unbounded one, within the circumscribed milieu, the third figure, right, threatens to unbound it, the milieu itself. The deformed body has difficulty traversing, right, enough of the milieu space to map it in the way, for example, the miner's activities do in Germinal, across the space of the novel and up and down into the depths of the mine. Nana's transgressions, on the other hand, indicate that the relevant milieu is the totality of society, which is bounded, but also not delimited, not a space within. Thus, the three figures, I think, don't fit neatly as dimensions of one phenomenon, but rather represent centrifugal forces emanating out of a shared sensibility of modernity that we recognize as naturalism. So this dispersive effect, I think, is one of the big contributions of the book, which, you know, it presents very forcefully and clearly without losing the sense of that, okay, I can still see this is naturalism, right? So according to Auerbach, and I always come back to Auerbach, Zola rescues the project of realism by capturing the social impulse of his times. That was Auerbach's phrase, right? And rendering this social impulse, historically. If we turn to Auerbach's earlier chapters in Mimesis, we find the following in his discussion of Dante. Imitation of reality, this is a quotation, is imitation of the sensory experience of life on earth, amongst the essential characteristics of which would seem to be its possessing a history. It's changing and developing. This is a very famous sentence, I'm sure you recognize it. Here, Auerbach associates two features of realism to each other, the sensory and the historical, that have come to be separated from each other. The sensory has conventionally been the focus of naturalism, and in that context, it has been seen as undermining the historical, miring the novel subjects in a determined biological condition from which there seems to be little hope of actively shaping a developing destiny. The question how sensory experience manifests historicity, despite or even perhaps because of its boundedness, is key for making the jump from Chris's three figures to my own work. And I'm going to discuss a little bit how it connects up to my work in postcolonial literature as a way of demonstrating how productive this book is, how generative it is. Scholars of the postcolonial African novel recognize a naturalist thread that runs through South African protest fiction, for example. Alex Laguma's A Walk in the Night is a commonly cited example, but also through the African realism of the early post-independence period, the mode which captured most compellingly the experience of disillusion. But as Neil Lazarus notes, this African naturalism exhibits an optimism of the will. This is his phrase, whereby the protest, which documents the grinding poverty and urban dysfunction experienced by African subjects aspiring for a freedom yet to come, channels a commitment to action. So that's the optimism of the will. The ugly, drawn with extreme attention to detail, is confronted and then accepted as ground zero from which to rise. Whereas the refusal of determinism, in fact, the deployment of what appears like a naturalist aesthetic in order to achieve the opposite end and convey convincingly the chances of an escape, has been the grounds to dispute the authenticity of African naturalism or even to reject its possibility with a sense of relief. However, these works become newly legible, I think, as yet another manifestation of a transnational form of naturalism, which uses a particular, a transnational form which uses a particular naturalist matrix as a point of departure. Perhaps, therefore, naturalism endures because it toggles with realism rather than replaces it in a succession, as Lukács has suggested. For Lukács, the progression took us in the wrong direction, toward the novel's decreased engagement with historical forces, right? So there's a decline. You go from realism, like Chris said, Chris Bush, right? We love Zola, we love Balzac, we love Flaubert, and then that we have this decline. I suggest that Chris Hill's now intervention makes it possible to argue that the push and pull between these engagements with the real keep the problem of history within reach, even as it seems to be pushed down or cast aside. And let me turn very briefly to my example, which is Tsitsi Dangaremba's feminist Bildungsroman, Nervous Conditions, which has become a canonical text of African realism, yet it has been faulted for its incomplete account of history, its elision of the Zimbabwean War of Liberation, which was raging but never gets a mention in the novel. In completing the trilogy of her protagonist's story 30 years after the publication of the first volume, Dangaremba has gone a long way towards redressing this omission and draws out the extensive trauma suffered by her protagonist Tambu as a result of her family's suffering in the war. The two novels that complete the trilogy, moreover, take on a much more naturalistic tenor, becoming quite dark and despairing in the mire that was post-colonial Zimbabwe under Mugabe's repressive rule. Strikingly, Dangaremba describes Tambu's difficulties in terms that Chris's study flags for us as one of the naturalist figures. I was really struck by the coincidence in the language, right? So in the Book of Not, which is the middle volume now of the trilogy, Tambu describes herself as, quote, cracked and defective. She has a crack that puts her at a disadvantage in comparison to her more privileged, mostly white schoolmates, an inheritance of colonialism that marks her alienated subjectivity's repression of her family's peasant background and an unassimilated war experience and her sense that she won't overcome this. The crack, and that's the term that carries over into Chris's study, into the book, right? He talks about his first figure as the cracked body. The crack conditions her history, whereas it is also what marks her relationship to history. Thus, we toggle with her between realism and naturalism, where naturalism signals the unassimilable, that which perhaps needs a greater hindsight, more time to return to and to be treated realistically. So in other words, we may, in the case of the African novel, have started out with a form of realism and now been in a protracted naturalist phase that sort of is a placeholder, a time, for enough time to pass where we might be able to take a fuller account of the historical impact of events, right? So I'm very interested in this, in sort of like not thinking exclusively of one mode or another, but thinking of how they are working in synergy. I have another example that comes from my literature and human rights, or another set of terms that I could talk about my literature and human rights work, but I'm going to put that aside so that we can get more discussion going, and maybe we can come back to it. So I'll turn it over to Hector now. Thanks.
Thank you, Eleni, Christopher, and Chris. It's great to be with you, and you've said pretty much everything. So at this point, it's all downhill from here. I will second the Laudatio. I think this is an important book. I think it's a book that has great futurity. And since you have already covered some of the central claims, I'm going to focus on that futurity. What can other critics do with this? What can graduate students do with this going forward? One of the topics that is mentioned with less focus in the book is Latin America, but it is included, also Spain, in Pérez Galdós, and so on. And I find that there is just so much potential to dig deeper in this direction, and that Chris's book does a great job at doing some of the legwork that future scholars will hopefully undertake. So beyond the French, Japanese, US triangle in the book, there is a matrix from where one can grow. And indeed, the travels of Nana in the world can take scholars far and wide. One needs to follow something like Chris's non-committal method. And by non-committal, I mean, this is not a top-down endeavor. The resistance to definition is, I think, salutary. I think it's a great feature of this book because I'll quote also some passages of the book. When we read the definition of naturalism, what we find instead is a meandering around the difficulty of defining it, and then Chris's book takes 2 steps back and finds that in itself telling and symptomatic. When it comes to definitions, then I propose taking writers and critics at their word. If they called it naturalism, then naturalism it was. By the same token, I suggest accepting what scholars of different literatures consider to be naturalism in their context. I mean, this sounds simple enough, but as some of you know better than I do, having studied naturalism, throughout the better part of your careers, it's a huge shift. We are building on the shoulders of giants always in our profession, but when you have a giant like Georgi Lukács, who disparages naturalism, and you have this huge animosity against naturalism as something that is derivative, that is bad realism, that is formulaic, and so on and so forth, it's really hard to do what this book does, which is to take the writers in a certain moment of time seriously, and to acknowledge that their nod to Zola and to naturalism, as vague as it can be in some of these writers, as thin a connection as it may be, can be in itself revealing. So to do that, Figures of the World has to craft a methodology that is neither distant reading, nor I would say close reading, even though the book does say that it engages with close reading, and it does, but it is not the kind of close reading we're accustomed to. There is also that second level sociological reflection about why the Zola model source of inspiration, or the native indigenous, if you will, like taking up of the flag of naturalism may or may not coincide with the society at hand, right? So it is a mixed methodology. It's radically a posteriori and very generous to what the literature has to offer, and that is quite rare. So that's something to think about, not just in applying the book further to Latin Americanism, but to other fields. On the Latin Americanism bit in particular, let me point at a couple of examples that appear in various moments in the book. One of them is Acevedo, who was already mentioned, the underappreciated great Brazilian author. And let's see what Chris Hill does with Acevedo here. And commenting, of course, on the literature on Acevedo. An explanation by the eminent Brazilian critic Antonio Cândido highlights the conditions in which a writer like Acevedo undertook a Zolean plan. The structure of the Rougon-Macquart series, Cândido argues, reflected the relatively great social and economical differentiation in the French society of Zola's time, in which the worlds of politics, finance, industrial labor, shopkeepers, and so on were distinct and distant from each other. Zola could write a novel on each segment, the better to treat it in own terms. Such a, italicized, specialization of novels was impossible in Brazil, where the capitalist and the worker were tightly attached, first of all by slavery, which affected the position of enslaved laborers alike. This and other discussions of Roberto Schwartz talk about the real existing conditions, the on-the-terrain conditions for naturalism, right? And for the discourse on naturalism to be operating sometimes in an alignment with the bourgeois ideology, and sometimes resisting it in surprising ways. And what future scholars would be, wise to do is to appreciate this kind of discontinuity between the ideology and the society, as it also informs the narratives themselves. There's a different moment when Cândido claims that Acevedo's book is actually better than Zola's. It's a better L'Assommoir. It's better and more dire and more depressing even than L'Assommoir, if that is possible. This book takes that. This monograph takes that observation seriously and thinks about the problem of the original and the copy, and how, in light of rhizomatic world literature, much as that term is sometimes maligned in this book, we can resist this kind of radical from original to copy narrative that compounds the misunderstandings of naturalism that come to literary criticism pretty much in our DNA through someone like Lukács. Okay, and given that I have 3 minutes of being mindful of the time, I'm going to start segueing into some questions, again, thinking of the futurity of this book. One, I think, is the theoretical question that the book doesn't always explicitly address, but I feel does the necessary work to fully address in propriety, without imposing top-down categories, but rather seeing how also theoretical questions emerge from the literature itself. And that would be the question about whether naturalism is part of what leads the world to encounter itself, if it's some kind of on aggregate semantic device for the real to become real in literary terms. The question for realism, one could say that is, the question that I'm asking, given that naturalism is in this book some subset of realism. So having done the work of looking, as Lukács never did, as so many others never did, beyond narrowly defined national traditions into Japanese, French, US, and also, I want to say, Latin American traditions, how is naturalism contributing or not to the world encountering with itself? That would be one big question. Then there is also more of an institutional question, and I think that Christopher Busch has already mentioned this to some extent, having to do with the reticence to consider this phenomenon global, or this monograph inscribed under world literature. So I would just maybe push on that question. I feel that maybe there's a double standard where naturalism is what writers think naturalism is. If they claim it to be naturalism, it is. But then if scholars call something global, then it isn't. maybe this is a false, analogy. Maybe the stakes are different, but that's also why I'm raising the question, maybe as a devil's advocate, to some extent, if whether this book is ultimately global and world literature without qualification, right? And then finally, the last question is, I guess, the Jameson question. It has more to do with criticism, because a big interlocutor of this book is the Antinomies of Realism that came out, I think, in 2015, so not that long ago. It's on the horizon. There, James examines the oppositions between things like naturalism and modernism. He claims that naturalism embodies the most extreme form of bourgeois anxiety in light of the possibility of, sorry about the noise, in light of the possibility of falling from grace, falling from money, falling from status, losing one's hard-earned, savings to the folly of building into the ocean, as we see in La Joie de Vivre. There is this, and this has a consequence in Jameson. Let me read now from Jameson, because I think these books are natural interlocutors. I can foresee someone publishing a comparative book review essay of these two, given that Jameson is also very not a global writer in that book. Naturalism is far more class-marked and localized than realism in general, says Jameson, and strikes the reader as far more specialized than the latter, to the degree that the public no longer shares those particular fin de siècle terrors. So the idea is you had to be a striving bourgeois losing it all to understand the woe, the sadness, the depression of these I can lose it all at any moment naturalist fictions. Whereas you can believe in something like the American Dream to read Balzac's more uplifting rags to riches realist stories, right? So, just my question would be, how would you engage with Jameson and these arguments about bourgeois anxiety and the antinomies of realism? Again, thank you very much.
But thank you so much for all of those comments and questions. And everyone who has published a book realizes that at a certain point they're just trying to get it done, and then afterward they rediscover what was interesting about the project. And so thank you for helping me to that point. I guess this will be sort of a free form and somewhat meandering response to everyone in a sense, because interestingly, I think that Chris and Eleni and Hector were all focusing in on some common issues, and then in a sense also like some choices that I had to make to get this project off of the ground. And maybe the place to start would be the issue of world literature, and why I say that it's not a book about world literature or a book of world literature, even though the press correctly decided that world literature should be in the kind of marketing presentation. And that is not wrong. So as I start to describe in the preface, and then as I think I return to at different points in the later parts of the book, one of my objections to the theoretical arguments about world literature was that they strove for a kind of totalization, like a complete theory of the geographical diffusion of the novel, for example, that I thought was a mistake, because this kind of history is really messy, and it's quite contradictory, and there are strange things that are hard to explain. Another way to put that would be, this is not a history of like trees It's more like a history of a hairball. It's just hard to sort out. And you wouldn't want to try to put it into a tree form by, like, you know, pulling all the hairs apart or something like that. And another reason that I resisted the label of world literature as a matter of sort of totalization was that, practically speaking, there were many parts of this history that I just was not going to be able to talk about. I didn't have the linguistic expertise, but I also didn't have the page numbers. I mean, as I think Chris Bush discerned, this either had to be a skinny book or a really fat book, and writing a really fat book was not an option. But that led to, I think, a kind of methodological position that I also tried to work out in National History in the World of Nations, this earlier book, of trying to be open to additional work and more conclusions, which I sort of maybe naively hoped would be sort of an extension as opposed to, like, you know, a contradiction of things that I had argued. But that this would have to be a kind of project that would acknowledge the work of many other people, and then would hope that other people would in turn sort of join into that. And I think that that should be the kind of position or kind of approach that people take to working on literary history on a large scale, sort of in general, as opposed to trying to come up with sort of the single explanation of everything. And the choice to make this into kind of a tripod of a book, looking closely at naturalist fiction in France, Japan, and the United States, was a related choice. And people who've read Naturalism in the World of Nations know that I also took that approach in that book. But that kind of triangular approach just makes any kind of binary conclusions impossible. And it, I think, forces a kind of openness into argumentation, because there's always something that doesn't fit into conclusions that you could draw about the other two terms or something like that. So that was partly a choice driven by languages that I can work in, but it was also a kind of a choice of method and another way to establish this kind of openness, I hope, to other people's work. On that note, and thinking about the comparison that Hector made to Jameson's Antinomies of Realism, which I have to say, like, made me really shiver. I would say that one quality of the work of this amazing and really influential literary critic is that Jameson's particular use of Marx and Marxist literary criticism really centers on the assumption of an organic relationship between literary form and society. And he's done amazing analyses, starting the political unconscious and then on, and not only in literature, using that assumption, which people know goes way beyond some kind of ping pong causality, into matters of symptomatic reading and so on. As much as I admire that work, I find that that sort of methodological starting point of an organic relationship between literary form and society becomes a real obstacle in studying this kind of meandering transnational history, because when, say, Azevedo in Brazil starts to try to write like Zola's work doesn't have an organic relationship to the Brazilian context, right? And so Azevedo has to write differently. And I talk about that kind of situation in chapter 4 of the book as a really kind of productive failure. He discovers it's impossible to write about Brazil like Zola writes about France. And he creates this different kind of naturalism, which is clearly related to Zola's work, but in some ways really original and quite different, which is to say that, and this was actually, a bit of a difficult thing to give up on my own part as well, to understand the circulation of works and how form would change as it moves around the world. You have to give up sort of an initial set of assumptions about the relationship between form and society in order to arrive at maybe a new set of conclusions about what that relationship would be. And in the case of naturalist fiction, that relationship between form and society always is mediated through the transnational field, I think. So context in this case is not simply the society that a writer is living in, but also the transnational context of the history of the form and the gradual evolution of the transnational literary field. So I hope that in some of the readings I was able to get to that kind of conclusion, and I think by the end, in the reading of Tayama Katai's novel, The Country Teacher, we've sort of gotten to a point where the particular approach to description in Katai's novel, which he called flat description, really is both a reflection and a response to the situation of uneven development in Japan and then on a transnational scale. About the issue of Zola as an initiator, this is something also sort of difficult to deal with because his presence is so gigantic. And that would feed the assumption that everyone was just trying to do Zola in a good or bad way. But the degree of transformation of Zola's methods had to point to something else. And thinking about how to approach that, in one sense, it had to do with looking at what's really going on in, say, the work of Jack London or Shimazaki Toson. And then in another way, to question the originality of Zola. And this sort of speaks to Chris's comments about iteration. Zola's work was a crystallization of different literary currents, of various cliches, of some ideas from biology that he sort of didn't completely do justice to because he wanted them to mean something else, right? And so he seemed to be, even in his own terms, even just sort of looking at Zola's work itself, not so much the absolute originator, but one kind of early version in a kind of a series of transformations. And then from a different point of view, a kind of organizing principle of the transnational literary field, which did not have so much to do with the person, but with the name, sort of invoking Zola. So I'll just say something quickly about what's left out, which also I think is something that Chris brought up, but that Elena and Hector were sort of touching on as well. And then I hope that we will also be getting some questions from the audience. There were a lot of things left out. Theater would lead to a different set of arguments, and I concluded in a sense that had to be different history. Poetry, but also naturalist fiction in other parts of the world that are not really in here. Just trying to acknowledge them, but not pretending to be able to write about them, hoping that someone else would be able to do that. And then all of the afterlives, which I had imagined at one point would be a much bigger part of the book. But one of the interesting qualities of this history is that as naturalism took different shapes in different parts of the world, so too the afterlives in different parts of the world were quite different. And in a sense, you might say that the point where you would stop talking about the history of naturalism and start talking about the history of afterlives is the point where there's a kind of increasing sense of incomparability between descendants of naturalism in one part of the world and descendants of naturalism in another part. And that itself is a really interesting history, but just something that was not only in terms of scope, but also kind of method was going to be difficult to deal with. So I had to part ways with a lot of those things in order to focus on the ultimate project, which, as I said, was to try to develop new sorts of methods, which ideally would be useful for other phenomena in literature and cinema and video games and all sorts of other forms of cultural expression. Anyway, thank you very much for all of the comments.
Shall we take some questions from attendees?
Sure.
Looks like we have at least one in already.
We do. An anonymous attendee asks, would it be possible to learn more about what the term transnational means in the context of this book? How is it different from or functions as a foil for the world and world literature?
Sure. That's an interesting, a great question. Transnational, in a certain sense, is meant to push back against world as a matter of scale, to not immediately jump to the scale of the globe, but think about intermediate scales, because naturalism as a bigger than national phenomenon did not really reach every corner of the globe, right? So proceeding on a global or a world scale would not really be completely appropriate to this history, and also a way of foregrounding that this history is both a history of these large-scale movements of writers reading other writers and so on, and a history that did also play out in national contexts. So different disputes or uproars over naturalist fiction were quite important in different parts of the world for the local literary scene, right? And those more local histories did in fact inflect the big history of the transnational phenomenon, right? But they can't be reduced to that history, because the things that people were arguing about vis-a-vis naturalist fiction in one place were not the same things that people were arguing about in another place. The debate in Japan was different from the debate in China or the debate in Argentina or the United States, and so on. So as I argue at a few different points in the book, this really calls for kind of a multi-scalar analysis, the ability to work on different scales in order to explain the whole phenomenon. And transnational as a term is intended to get us to that point. Are you happy to have other questions?
So I really liked what Hector said when he asked the question about whether we can think of naturalism as a moment of the world encountering itself. And I think that kind of connects up with my concerns about history a little bit more, maybe in a more conventional way of looking at realism and the relationship between realism and naturalism. But the word world is evoked in that phrase as well. And it's a different notion of world than the word literature world. And it doesn't preclude, I mean, one very kind of obvious way to think of that phrase, right? It doesn't preclude the very local, like my world is just my world here and my world looking in on itself, right? Although it could open up. So, and I think Hector also used the term matrix, right? That you offer a matrix. So all these different ways of connecting up to a larger context. So I don't know if that gives us something more to reflect on or not, but I thought that was a useful phrase. To me, the difficulty is connecting that idea that would be, in the naturalist fiction, you have a world encountering itself, which is all happening in a present, let's say, with the more long-term kind of hindsight, retrospective account that is the totalizing kind of Lukashian, like I'm going to try to understand the structures here, the contradictions, the ironies, et cetera, of the creative totality. So, naturalism is too much in the present. It still builds out, a very rich world, but it lacks that kind of perspective that even some realist fictions, which are not necessarily distant in time, assume that there's this kind of, distant perspective. So again, we're talking, it scales in a way, right? But I think your book provokes us to rethink all these relationships, or all the ways in which we move from the particular to the general, how we generalize, because you're really forcing us to think about how the form circulates and how it doesn't circulate as imitation or even as adaptation, but as a kind of idea that takes a spark and then, takes on these new forms.
If I can maybe append a question there, because I think these are great issues to continue the conversation. I wonder, Chris Hill, if you think there's a chance for a naturalist novel to really be successful today. And of course, in your definition, that author would have to call themselves like naturalists, but maybe they don't have to, right? I wonder if there's space for naturalism in the 21st century, as odd as that sounds, but you show how for 60 years in several continents, this thing continued to mutate. I wonder if another strain could come our way. I am 2 chapters into Don DeLillo's The Silence, and I will say nothing to spoil the reading for anyone, but it does, give me pause.
People who follow film may remember that in the 2010s, there was an argument about the new naturalism in film, right? And there were, I think, good reasons to make that argument about a really interesting group of films. And I did have a little reservation in that label, which really is just, I mean, it's perfectly fine. But one thing that I think you can see in the different afterlives of naturalist fiction in different parts of the world, one thing that they do tend to have in common is that they set aside the arguments about heredity and determinism, and also the ways in which those arguments really informed the literary form of naturalist fiction, because they were just both objectionable and unproductive. And so I think if we wanted to talk about the latter day naturalism, that would be something that we would not find. And I think you could actually perhaps argue that getting rid of that kind of problematic, which began with Zola and then persisted really for quite a long time, allowed writers and filmmakers to exploit the other possibilities of this method. And perhaps that might be another way of noting that things happen in the history of naturalism, broadly defined, that would not have happened if naturalism had remained in France, right? Part of the generative quality of it is that it gets around and people use it in ways that would not have been imaginable in France. About the issue of the world, I think what Elena said is really interesting, and Hector's elaboration of that issue as well. And it seems that one of the situations that arose constantly in the history of naturalist fiction that propelled it ahead formally was the necessity of adapting naturalist methods to the particular world, and maybe you would say both, like sort of the world immediately at hand, which in the world of Zoom is actually just this room where I spend all my time, but also the way that the world on a bigger scale looked and was experienced from the particular place where an author happened to be, so that the position of Korea or Mexico, what have you, geopolitically speaking, is also something that informs the ways that naturalist writers sort of confronted their worlds and adapted their worlds. So if naturalist fiction is a confrontation with the world in that way, then that just seems like a wonderful way to explain why this ended up being such a kind of fruitful and long-running kind of literary method. I noticed there were a couple of questions in the Q&A.
There are. One question is, there are a couple questions in this within one question. Going back to Moretti's conjectures on world literature, Moretti makes a methodological claim, which I find difficult to operationalize. Peripheral literatures, he says, undertakes a negotiation with dominant literatures by adopting foreign plot, creating local characters, and then local narrative voice. My issue with this claim, thinking of your analysis of the Nana figures, but also on Schwartz's misplaced ideas, which discusses Brakubas, is that I find it so difficult to separate different formal aspects in this way, or to distinguish so neatly the local and the transnational. My question then is, how did you go about separating contextual, local elements, value system, intellectual history, for instance, from the formal circulating aspects of your analysis? What and where did the challenges you met along the way?
Well, that's a question that brings back a lot of memories of trying to figure out how to do this project, and also, in a sense, one of the beginnings of the whole thing, because the argument that Moretti ultimately made in that really important early essay, I mean, important for me as well as for the bigger debate, is that most writers end up in a kind of compromise between this, foreign form and local narrative voice, or local characters, and so on. And I just couldn't accept that because it's so prejudicial somehow, right? I mean, I guess there would be many ways to explain what's going on, but compromise seems to imply a kind of failure, or kind of a realistic recognition that I can't do that, or something. And I guess in contrast, I tried, in thinking about individual novels, to first of all, maybe heuristically set aside this distinction between what was foreign here and what was local. And then to try to circulate or circle back and reach some conclusions about precisely that issue. And one approach or position that I think ended up being quite helpful is to approach naturalism as a method rather than as a particular form of the novel or literary form in itself, so it made it easier to talk about what a writer like Udafu was using with these sorts of tools. Think about that in a way that didn't present them as sort of hemmed in by having to deal with this sort of gigantic foreign example, and in more of a position to kind of pick and choose of what was going to work for them and what was not. And then maybe just one last point about that would be that along with the sort of trying to set aside a distinction between originality and imitation, accepting the strange things that happened as just completely valid, and thinking of them as only strange actually if you're looking at particular works in terms of a sort of a received sense of what they should be doing, and then finding that that's not what they're doing. Accepting the strange things that happened was a kind of way of approaching this that helped to solve that kind of issue about foreign form coming into local context and producing failures or compromises or something like that.
There's a second question. On the question of French literature, for instance, being characterized by an organic relationship between literary form and social reality, as opposed to marginal literatures, which would not produce such organic relationships, do you think this is a myth? That is it true that dominant literatures are organic? Thinking of Schwartz again, he claims in Misplaced Ideas that liberal meritocracy was upheld in Brazil, but not put into practice because of the structure of slave society, where favor and personal relations were the actual mechanisms of power distribution. But France at the time was only very partially meritocratic. Alejandro Mejias Lopez argues that the plenitude of the center's modernity, of which I presume organicity is a part, is more imaginary than real. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think that I would agree. The assumption about an organic relationship between form and society is something that goes far back in Marxist literary criticism, and maybe perhaps really starts with Lukács, if not Marx himself, in stray comments that he made about literature. And it is perhaps a little bit erroneous, and also at a certain point unhelpful, unproductive as a methodological sort of problematic. Schwartz's arguments, and then Candido's arguments as well, are really interesting in that respect, because sometimes it seems like they're just being gigantically sarcastic in sort of talking about how liberalism was never able to work in Brazil, for example, and yet also not sarcastic because they're quite aware that liberalism, in whatever form it was instantiated, did allow for the mass harvesting of surplus value, right? So I guess I try to sort of look at them in that way. And the comment that maybe the Brazilian novel was more original than the French one, for example, is sort of in that vein as well. And it's worth remembering the rest of that comment, which is that you shouldn't, however, be deluded into thinking that people in France were going to really recognize that, right? That is sort of the uneven structure of the world, which is also sort of the unevenness in Brazil that people like Azevedo were dealing with. I just wanted briefly to respond to this earlier question too about the next project, if I could. I'm working on Japanese writers and their responses to decolonization in the post-war period, which in some ways might seem more geographically defined, much more about Japan. But that project began through a sort of odd discovery that the Japanese Catholic writer Endo Shusaku had been reading Frantz Fanon in the early 50s, which was something that made no sense in any of the scholarship on Endo or on Fanon. So it did begin in a certain way with this larger issue of circulation, and partly in this case, the circulation of people, because Endo had gone to Lyon, where Fanon had studied, and seems to have learned about Fanon's work at that time. So I hope that it would be continuing to sort of work in that vein. But perhaps this would be the time to Thank everyone again, Chris, Eleni, Hector, Anne, for putting all of this together. I'm flattered and so pleased by your interest in the book, and I do hope that it will be something that would be helpful and is inspirational for people working on other kinds of topics.
Congratulations, Chris, and thanks so much. This was really interesting. I learned a lot.
Chris, this is so great. I know I'm going to be peppering you with questions for years to come. I wanted to make sure that everyone else got a chance to talk today. So I was trying to hold my tongue, but I've been scribbling furiously, and you'll be getting emails, and look forward to future discussions.
Great, thank you.
Same feelings here. Thank you very much. This was a treat. And kudos also to Northwestern and to Flashpoints, because every title is just solid.
Yeah. Great.
Congratulations to Chris, and thank you to the panelists for joining us. And thank you to everyone who attended. If you're interested in purchasing the book, NUP 2020 is good for a 25% discount. Head on over to our site. And thank you all again. Take care.